Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. This is Ryan Crodel at Valencell. Thanks for joining us here for what will be an outstanding webinar with our partners from Kenzen. Looks like we still have quite a few people logging into the webinar at the moment, so we'll give it another minute or so to allow those people to get in and get settled, and then we'll jump right into the content. So give us a few minutes here while others still join, and we'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks. Okay, it looks like the most of the attendees are in at the moment, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we'll go ahead and get started. For those of you who are just now logging in, this is Ryan Crodel from Valencell, and we're very pleased to have with us today Jim McDonnell, CEO and President of Kenzen. And Jim will be presenting most of the content that we have for you today, describing the exciting opportunities that Kenzen is going after, and the way they're going after them is with some really innovative technology that we're excited to be a part of. We'll hear from Jim in just a moment. Just a few minor housekeeping items before we dive in. As usual, we are recording this webinar, and we will make the slides available after the webinar, both the recording and the slides, for anyone who is interested in viewing this afterwards, or any of your colleagues who you may want to share this with. Please feel free to share with anyone who you think may be interested. We will send out the links to both the slides and the webinar recording after the webinar, either later today or tomorrow. And the only other housekeeping item I have is we like to make these as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, or if there's anything you'd like us to dive deeper on as the presentation goes along, please do submit your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll be monitoring those questions while Jim is sharing the information, and I'll jump in as those questions come up, and we will address them as we go along. We have also built in some time at the end for Q&A if you'd rather hold your questions to the end, but feel free to ask them as we go along, and we'll address those as they come up. So please do submit those questions through the control panel itself, and I'll jump in with those questions as they come up. So as I mentioned, Jim McDonnell is CEO and President of a company called Kenzen, who, as you will see in just a moment, has some very innovative technology, combining various sensor modalities into a monitoring solution that's being applied in several different areas, from industrial safety to health and medical and other applications that you'll see as we go along here. And Jim and Kenzen have been great partners of ours, and so we're very happy to be working with them with this device and helping them go after these new and different opportunities. So with that, I'll hand over to Jim and let him take it from here.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for the opportunity today, and thank you for the partnership over the past several years. So what I'm going to do is just take you all through a little bit of a journey of how Kenzen has developed our early warning system for personal health, with a particular focus on our initial market entry, which is for industrial worker safety. As Ryan indicated, if you have questions along the way, please don't hesitate to submit them via the panel, and happy to take those as we go. So just a very quick background on Kenzen itself. We were founded in 2014. Today have a total of 20 employees split between our headquarters here in San Francisco, and our R&D is in Zurich, Switzerland. That's actually where the majority of our employees are. Our mission really is to predict and prevent avoidable health conditions. And as I mentioned, our initial market focus is industrial worker safety. But as we develop out the platform and capabilities, we'll be entering into the clinical space as well. A few key highlights of the company's journey: we won a first and future athlete competition sponsored actually by the NFL in 2016, a TechCrunch competition. That got us into the sort of sphere of professional sports and athletics, which is certainly a significant area of focus and interest. Google Demo Day winner in 2017, May of last year in London. It was a Google Europe Demo Day. We actually joined with Valencell with a plug-and-play sponsored cohort with the Cleveland Clinic earlier this year, which gave us just tremendous access into the health ecosystem, and was for us an incredible opportunity to get connected there. And then more recently, in July of this year, we run Best Health Startup at CES Asia. So if we look at sort of the context for what Kenzen is focused at from a worker and from an employer perspective, worker safety is, of course, long been an issue, but it's a growing concern, not only because of the impact to the some 130 million workers with high-risk occupations in the United States, but certainly the economic toll of the injuries and illness of those workers, some $220 billion in the United States. Where Kenzen has been focused most recently, and I'll take you through specifically how we're addressing this, are those injuries and illnesses caused by heat-related issues. And for a variety of reasons, those are on an uptick. And so it's an area of significant concern. And often heat is actually an underlying root cause of other injuries. As your cognitive function declines and response rate declines, it's a cause of injury that isn't necessarily always attributed to heat. What that's meant in this what's called personal protective equipment market is that there's a shift in that market away from, I shouldn't say away from, but in addition to traditional personal protective equipment like the helmet the gentleman in the picture is wearing, and so forth, to now this smart personal protective equipment, which is really where sensor-enabled technology begins to provide much more personalized and contextualized safety specific to the individual, as opposed to what has historically been, fairly generic in terms of its source of protection. So, why are heat-related injuries increasingly in focus? Well, there's certainly, through global warming, there's a global increase in temperatures and more people working in these extreme conditions. That's creating an extra burden for the insurers, workers' comp insurance. This actually data is relative to China, where over the past 10 years, the number of workers covered under worker comp has doubled over 10 years. So it's a global phenomenon where there's more interest and focus on worker safety. And then we see a lot of additional regulatory scrutiny. In the United States, there was a petition recently submitted by several hundred clinicians and industrial safety professionals focused specifically on their ask that OSHA implement stronger heat guidelines for workers. In addition, as I said, on a global basis, there's more and more regulatory scrutiny to ensure that worker safety is being provided for. So heat is kind of an interesting area to focus, and one of the reasons is that today the guidelines for protecting workers from heat-related injury are very generic. So OSHA, for example, publishes heat guidelines that stipulate for different levels of outdoor temperature or ambient air temperature that there's different periods that workers should stay on a shift before they take a break and rehydrate. But in point of fact, heat is a very personalized and contextual condition. Everybody responds to heat differently, and in fact, your body responds to heat differently over time, or it changes over time as your body acclimates to heat. So it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to say, let's implement a standard guideline and expect that that guideline will, first of all, protect workers who otherwise should step away from their activity and rehydrate and cool down, or ensure those workers who are perfectly healthy and fit are continuing to work. And so it's one of those conditions where it really cries out for this sensor-based approach that allows us really to understand a very personalized and contextual view of the individual. As you look at the World Health Organization model for heat stress, there's really four things that they've modeled out to understand how the body responds to heat and how it then goes into a state of heat stress. And those are the level of activity, the core body temperature, not the temperature at the surface of the skin, but actually your core body temperature, as well as the heart rate and how heavily you're sweating. So you can actually look at a model that the World Health Organization has published that shows each of those will rise over time in sequence, and that really begins to outline that an individual is headed to a state of becoming, succumbing to heat stress. So what Kenzen has done is developed a platform, and heat stress for industrial workers is the first application of that platform, but the platform will be applied to a multitude of both industrial as well as clinical use cases and others as we go into markets like sports, as I mentioned earlier, and other markets. But at its core, we have a real-time biosensing monitor that's worn on the body that can look both at vital signs as well as activity. But also we've introduced now some innovative and groundbreaking biomarker analysis through our sweat biomarker analysis platform. That data is ingested into our cloud platform, which is where our machine learning models reside. And it really allows us to take personalized information about the individual, contextualize it in the with respect to things like the outdoor temperature or other things that are important to understand with respect to that individual, and provide that on a continuous basis so that we can dynamically notify an individual as it relates to, in the industrial case, heat alert, as well as in the industrial case, the safety supervisor, for example, that needs to be sure that any alert triggered on a worker has been actioned and that worker is taking the appropriate steps to protect themselves. So this is just a picture of the current monitor as it's being produced. You can see the dimensions there on the top left, and what the body facing on the bottom portion looks like. There's actually 7 sensors that are contained within this small footprint. We have, of course, the balance cell PPG, which is key to our ability to get heart activity, as well as a 1-lead ECG. We provide, as we'll describe in the next slide, the electrochemistry that we are able to monitor, an optical sensor to look at hydration levels under the skin, heat flux, which allows us to really look at core body temperature on a highly accurate basis. A sweat rate, as I mentioned, that's one of the key inputs into our model, and it's a highly unique sensor that allows us, through both measurement as well as models, to really calculate the milliliters of sweat loss per hour. That actually has multiple uses, not only in heat stress, but also in other clinical applications. We also have a bioimpedance sensor, as well as a 6-axis IMU, which gives us not just linear motion, but rotational motion, which is very important as we really begin to model motion very accurately. So as I mentioned on the top there, those are the 4 dimensions: sweat rate, heart rate, core temperature, and activity that are inputs into our machine learning model. And the machine learning model then becomes highly personalized and tuned to the individual. As I said, each individual will respond differently, and your response to heat will change over time based on how you're acclimatized to the environment. We communicate off of this device northbound via BLE connectivity. This would be potentially to a mobile phone if it's a remote worker, for example. Some of our early pilots are with maintenance engineers that maintain wind turbines, often out in remote areas where they climb these 100-meter tall ladders inside these wind turbines to perform maintenance. Much of the maintenance, by the way, on wind turbines is done in summertime because that's when winds are lowest and therefore they're producing the least energy. So they can be taken offline with minimal impact. We have roughly 30 hours of runtime with about a 2-hour recharge time. We can actually extend the runtime substantially through firmware, and we can throttle individual sensors to gain additional runtime as necessary. We can store about 24 hours of streaming data on the device itself. That's important in the event, for example, that we lose connectivity to the gateway or to the Bluetooth device, that we're able to store and then resync data once we reconnect. And then one other feature that we added based on customer requests was a haptic, which then allows the device to be vibrated to notify the worker in the event that they need to pay attention to an alert. Because of course, workers in these situations aren't necessarily always, staring at their mobile phone. So we've built models for 2 positions on the body. We prefer a chest placement because then our ECG data can then be leveraged. But the device can also be worn on the upper arm. We get good sensor readouts from that position. But again, because the models are developed to be highly personalized, things, for example, like sweat rate vary dramatically depending on the positioning of the body. So in order to get an accurate calculated sweat rate value, we need to know where the device is placed. That's actually one of the features of the mobile app, is to capture that placement information, so that our model then can accurately calculate what the milliliters of sweat loss per hour are. Others of our measures also depend on an understanding of the placement on the body. So the solution that Kenzen has developed is called Predictive Workforce Safety, and it starts with the monitor that I described and the measurements that we take off of that, but it includes an enterprise-level solution that ingests the data to the cloud. Our machine learning models run, the ability then to generate an alert and send that alert to the worker. There's 3 levels of heat risk that OSHA has identified that we're able to alert on. We can ask the worker then to prompt them to report back what actions they're taking. Are they resting? Are they rehydrating? And so forth, as well as asking them, for example, to report other symptoms if they're feeling dizzy or other things that would be very important to a medical professional, for example, or somebody, a safety supervisor on the site, to understand if there's something else going on with that worker. And then you see in the back there, that's a screenshot of the safety supervisor dashboard. So at a given site, there might be hundreds of workers, and this allows a safety personnel to look at all of the workers and identify those workers that have an identified heat alert. And again, to ensure that the right protocol is being followed and that worker is taking the appropriate action to protect themselves from whatever injury may result if they don't act on that predictive alert.
Hey Jim, we had one question come in here before you
Great.
dive into that next slide. Question is, does BMI have any effect on the data capture accuracy?
It does, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we capture, one of the things that we do when you first set up your profile as a user is we capture basic information, height, weight, gender, and other things. And BMI is an important personalization characteristic of that model and many of the models. Yeah.
Great, thank you. One other question just came in. If the sensor is worn on the chest, how does it adhere?
Yeah, so there's actually an adhesive, which I'll show in the next slide, but there's a 2-layer adhesive, one with the adhesive on the back, and then there's a skin-facing adhesive. So it's applied almost like a bandage. That adhesive is actually also where our sweat chemistry is spotted, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But it's applied just like a Band-Aid might be.
Gotcha. And one other question, sorry, but before you move on, question is, what processor is it based on?
We're using the Nordic chipset for our
Okay.
device. Yep.
Very good. Yep, that's looks like that's it for now.
Okay. So just, this applies across a range of industries where workers are in circumstances either of high heat or high exertion. We have pilots running now in renewable energy and construction, but significant interest in mining, oil and gas, manufacturing. But then beyond that, as I mentioned, there's a number of applications. We, as I said, won a competition a few years ago for Athlete of the Future, and actually the San Francisco 49ers are an investor in Kenzen. So there's significant opportunity to apply this in that space, youth athletes, elderly care at home, for example. So anywhere where you need to deploy this kind of precise clinical level quality monitoring, you begin to see opportunities to leverage the platform.
Jim, one other question along those lines. Any data on military usage, as in training or combat?
Yeah, we've gotten requests from every service, and there is significant interest in military application. In particular, we've done some initial work around a hydration model, and there's been certainly a lot of interest in that space. The Air Force has done a significant amount of work in researching that. As an example, so both heat and hydration are for military and first responders of keen interest. So we would expect, as we roll the solution out in the industrial space, which we'll be doing in the latter part of this year, that we'll then have the opportunity to address the military and first responder markets as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. So our market entry, as we discussed, is really these heat-related injuries, targeted initially at industrial workers, but as you can see there also, as we expand into markets like military and athletes, and it really is focused on just those 4 core measures. The device itself is measuring a lot more than that, but those are the core 4 that are used in that model. As I'll show you here in a moment, we also have some groundbreaking technology that allows us to do a biomarker analysis in sweat in real time, and we've delivered capabilities to monitor sodium, potassium, and pH levels. And so as you look at where that can really apply, certainly, as I mentioned, things like hydration, very important as you look at ion imbalance. But also there are specific conditions where changes in potassium level, for example, can be used to really better and more effectively manage those conditions like heart failure and kidney disease. The platform for biomarker sensing is extensible, and so we can then, as we develop additional biomarker electrochemistry, we can then deploy that on the patch and deliver patches that are focused at specific at-risk opportunities, depending on the biomarker that would be important in that condition. So as we go beyond the industrial market, as we go into the clinical market, we then have the opportunity really to deliver, as an FDA-regulated device, solutions that are really targeted at specific conditions based on individual biomarkers. So this gives you just a sense.
I'm sorry, and this actually, there's a couple other questions that just came in and may tee up this next slide pretty well. One is, as these applications are mission critical and real-time tracking is important, why go for Bluetooth or non-cellular connectivity rather than standalone cellular connectivity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Bluetooth is a starting point for us. We will definitely be implementing other communication protocols. Cellular, part of what we have to balance, of course, is battery consumption, and so there are some challenges as we move into some of these other protocols like cellular. But for sure, I would expect we need to deliver a device that supports cellular, LoRa, for example, as we move into some of the other industrial markets. And we're just beginning exploration and early testing of that. But yeah, we will definitely move beyond Bluetooth.
Got it. And then the next question, I think, it leads right into this slide, which is, have you looked at glucose?
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely something we get asked about a lot. It's of keen interest. It is, I will say, a very crowded space. So there's a lot of activity. Of course, that's for a very good reason. It has significant application. Or our roadmap is we're really kind of laying out a roadmap of what we want to do beyond sodium, potassium, pH. Certainly, additional ions are important for us to address. Things like lactate and cortisol have very interesting clinical applications, as well as correlation into industrial for things like stress and fatigue and so forth. So yeah, glucose is available in sweat. It's available in concentration levels that would allow us, we believe, to measure the concentration levels, to develop the electrochemistry to do that. What we're doing now is sort of assessing what are the next biomarkers that make sense, both based on the technology as well as what the market opportunity is. So this does give you a sense just about how the second layer of the patch then sort of comes into play. And so attaching to the monitor is this disposable patch. Now, for the industrial market where we don't need the sweat biochemistry, this is what we call a dumb patch. So it's just an adhesive, and it would apply to the monitor, and then you would adhere it to the body. What you're seeing here then is the introduction of our smart patch, which is where we begin to layer in the electrochemistry, and we can therefore channel, using our microfluidic technology, the sweat to that. In the center picture there, you'll see the blue part, which is blown up on the right-hand portion of the screen. That's actually where the electrochemistry is spotted. In this particular instance, each of those represents a different biomarker, sodium, potassium, and pH, and then there's a control spot there at the bottom. So this is a fairly complicated engineering feat, and much of our core IP centers around how we're able to process the sweat using these very sophisticated microfluidics. Of course, the electrochemistry itself, which performs the analysis as well as the evaporation and wicking process, so that we get continuous clean streams of sweat. One of our core design principles is we're a continuous platform. So there are many ways that you can do point-in-time measurements of biomarkers through blood draw or saliva, urine, and those certainly have great application in many places. But what we're looking to do is really deliver the ability to do that continuous measurement. And of course, sweat is one of the only, and certainly the non-invasive way that can be performed. In developing this, we've been certainly focused on the material itself, which, as you might imagine, is absolutely central to the ability to both spot the electrochemistry as well as to implement the microfluidic engineering that's needed to process and channel the sweat. And so earlier this year, we signed a partnership with Gore, inventors Gore-Tex, and one of the leading material science companies in the world. And we've finished the first phase of project with them to deliver the patch using their materials, and now working with them on a co-development effort on improvements in the underlying substrate as it relates to microfluidics and electrochemistry. And then in terms of sort of how we then view the clinical market, we've got, as I mentioned, we were very privileged together with Valencell to be a participant in the first ever Cleveland Clinic incubator program. That was just hugely useful for us to gain great insights into the clinical application and opportunity. And then through our R&D group in Switzerland, we've established relationships with a couple of hospitals in Switzerland that are just beginning now to do validation of our sodium and potassium measurement in comparison to blood, which will be an important benchmark for us as we look to the clinical market.
Jim, a couple other questions in here.
Great.
I mean, I think this first one relates back to the BMI question around the additional information you get about the individuals. The question is, please outline the specific health-related profile inputs used to establish an individual's baseline, from which variances are measured and outputs are generated.
Yep. So right now it's relatively basic profile information. So it's height, weight, age, gender, That may be it. There's a couple of others perhaps, but it's relatively basic profile information. That profile information is what's needed as a baseline input to establish the kind of the baseline model for an individual. In terms of health related information, as we move into the clinical application, and as we look at things like congestive heart failure, for example, there will doubtless be significant additional information that is incorporated to personalize the model for the individual. But for the heat stress model that I was describing, it's those four characteristics that are personalized dimensions of the model.
Got it. Okay. And then one other question: are you able to determine total sweat flow rate?
We are. Yes, that's actually one of the unique characteristics of our platform. As I mentioned, it's fairly complicated to calculate. It is, of course, it depends heavily on where in the body you're taking the measurement, as well as the factors that I described earlier, the personalized information. But yeah, we have models now built that allow us to calculate with a high degree of accuracy milliliters of sweat loss per hour. That, by the way, just one thing I would add to that is that becomes quite important, because as you look at biomarker concentration in sweat, there are some biomarkers that correlate linearly to blood, but there are others that actually depend on sweat volume. That is, they change based on sweat volume. And so one of the reasons for us accurate sweat rate is so important is that as we look at the clinical application and we understand biomarkers and they have correlation to blood, we need to understand, the sweat volume in order to be able to calculate that.
Gotcha. Okay. And then another question that just came in: do you look at stress beyond heat?
We don't currently. There's certainly, and as you look at adding, for example, cortisol, you begin to get very interesting opportunities to better understand stress levels. And in the model itself, I think there's an opportunity to begin to look at other elements of stress, but we're not doing that today. Today, the stress measurement that we're providing is heat related.
Got it. Okay. Looks like that's all the questions for now. Your last slide, is that correct?
It is. Yeah, that was.
Okay. Well, that was really good stuff, and you guys have made some really tremendous progress, particularly on the core body temp stuff, which is always extremely challenging to do, of course, without at least non-invasively.
Yep, exactly.
So a commitment for that certainly, and the engineering effort it's taken to put all of these sensors together and get those fused into a model that's in a relatively small patch has been really remarkable. So I'll just say to everyone in attendance, please do, if you've got questions or anything you want us to dive deeper on that we've covered here, then please do submit those questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. And it looks like we've got a few more that have come in as we've been talking here for a moment. So let's get right into those. Next question is: activity can be difficult to measure, particularly if the sensor is placed on different parts of the body. You said that the chest was best for each CG, but that is more difficult for activity. I guess not really a question, but I think you see where it's going.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, activity is seemingly relatively simple, but extraordinarily complex, particularly if you move beyond just linear motion. So we look at activity right now relatively simply, and that is just minutes of cumulative activity. So as we begin to really explore profiling activity very precisely, then there are definite additional complications, and as you observe, the placement of the patch impacts the ability to profile activity very precisely. Right now, as I said, the input into our model is minutes of cumulative activity, as far as it relates to understanding heat stress. And so in that context, we get what we need off the device. But it's a very good observation. I mean, activity is a very, very complicated thing to get it if you're going beyond just linear motion steps.
Well, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of what you're able to do is contextualize the body's response to that activity as well, which is primarily what you're looking for. Obviously, the activity context matters, but how the body responds to that activity is as important, if not more important. And that's what some of the other sensors beyond just the accelerometer get you.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a great point. So we use activity as a key input to many of our models because, of course, your body is behaving differently if it's under, it's active than if it's sedentary. So, just understanding the motion as it relates to, how your body is responding and is that response normal or not is an important input. And that's, again, why we've taken this approach of sort of multiplex sensing, is that we're looking to ensure that we draw those correlations and that we're able to understand, in context what's going on as opposed to simply seeing that somebody's heart rate is elevated. If we understand the combination of motion with that, it becomes much more meaningful in the context of building models.
Yeah. Great. Let's see. Next question. What is the role of the heart rate monitor in this patch?
So for the initial solution, it's really the heart rate as an input into the model for heat stress. So heart rate is the second thing that begins to sort of change as in the heat stress model, and so that's a key input. As we move beyond that, and certainly as we combine both PPG and ECG, and we move into clinical application, we see significant opportunity to leverage heart rate data in a multitude of additional models. But it is one of the core inputs into our heat stress model today, heart rate.
Gotcha. Next question is around roadmap timeline. So obviously share only what you feel comfortable with sharing in terms of specific timelines. But the question is, what are your estimated timelines for rolling out the next technology levels?
Mm-hmm. So it's a great question. We'll be where we are right now in the industrial market is we have active pilots underway. We expect to move into production deployments in probably, I would say, mid and really start scaling industrial in the early part of next year. We will be layering in additional models and features for our industrial solution. So that might include, things like fall detection, or as I mentioned, a hydration model, other things that our industrial customers would be looking for. As it relates to the clinical market, our current plan would be sometime in mid to late 2020 is when we feel we could release a solution in the market. Focused on our initial indication that we're focusing on is patient monitoring for congestive heart failure, and so that would likely be, given the FDA cycle, sometime in mid to late 2020, we would guess.
Gotcha. Next question: when you look at continuous, is once per minute or more or less often? I guess. How often do you define continuous?
Yeah, it's much more than once a minute. I mean, it's down to the millisecond, depending on the individual sensor. But the device itself, with everything running full throttle, generates over 3 million data points per day. So the sample rate is very high. Now, to be honest, we don't necessarily need that frequency of data from all of the sensors for all of the models. One of the things we've sort of decided as a design principle is that we would rather get more data, certainly early on, because it helps us to train the model and to develop new models. But as I mentioned, we can, through firmware, then throttle the sensors, and we would likely do that. But yeah, our current sample rates are for every sensor, typically several times a second.
Gotcha. Next question. Whoops. Almost skipped one. Here's the next question is, as your application is targeting very specific market areas, who are your main competitors?
Mm-hmm. So in heat stress, there's two other solutions in the space. One from another startup in the UK and another from Fujitsu. They're different form factors and really deployed, we think in a relatively different manner, nonetheless focused on heat stress. So those are the two specific competitors in that market. As we look more broadly at industrial worker safety, we see certainly big players like 3M and Honeywell, for example, with large footprints in those markets. We perceive as much more complementary to us than competitive, but certainly big players in that market. But as it relates to heat stress, there's two solutions we've identified that are targeting a similar area of focus.
Gotcha. Okay, let's see. Next question is, what types of strategies are your customers using in order to gain compliance? In other words, how do you get workers to wear the patch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and it's one of the things in our pilot methodology that we work very extensively on. Is the pilot involves it's a 4-phase pilot, and the first phase is a design workshop, and that really brings workers into the process to begin to surface early on concerns they may have around things like data privacy and protection and how data is made available. We have, by the way, a 3-tiered data access model where only the worker can see underlying data like heart rate. As you get to the safety supervisor level, they can just see a summary that that a worker has a heat alert, for example. They can't go in and look at individual information about that worker. So we bring the worker in early in the process to understand what are the things that might be issues for them. How do they, basic things like how do they start their workday? Do they go to a central office, or for these wind turbine maintenance engineers, they typically go straight to the site from their home, for example. So how does that affect how the patch would be put on? How is it charged? How do you make sure they have replacement adhesives? So we've really taken a very comprehensive view of exactly that question. There at the end of the day, there will be workers who probably for whatever reason are going to resist the technology. What we've seen, however, and we've worked, by the way, as well with the unions on this topic as well, is that there's significant interest on the part of the worker as well as the organizations representing them to explore new technologies that can really safeguard them, because they do see their fellow workers or themselves exposed to these risks. Many workers in these kind of environments understand the impact of heat on their body and are anxious to find ways to protect themselves. But it's a good question. We're still relatively early, so I'm sure we'll surface other issues that will be change management hurdles for us to overcome. But so far, we've been incorporating workers into the process to make sure that we're caring for their concerns and that this is as frictionless as possible for them.
Got it. Good stuff. Great questions. Keep them coming. There are quite a few more here, so we'll keep going. Next question is the ECG taken by 2 electrodes located not too far from each other?
Yeah, they're far enough. That's a good question. That's one of the reasons the form factor is the size that it is. It's the minimum distance required for the ECG loop. Yeah, it's a great question. But yeah, it's a 1 lead ECG with two signals. So it's a 1 loop. And the distance separation is, again, one of the reasons the device has the form factor it does, is to gain that separation that's required to create a loop.
Got it. Next question. Some other wearables can also measure tissue oxygenation, blood pressure, etc. Are you going to include those in your next device, or in your device, I should say?
It's a possibility. We've developed this, as you've seen here, as a platform where we can integrate multiple sensors, we can integrate additional sweat chemistry, but our guiding principle is really what problem are we trying to solve. The other thing that we look at is, are there existing ways of delivering those measurements today that are already highly effective. We are also a open innovation platform, so we incorporate like the balance cell sensor onto our platform, and we would look to partner with other sensor providers to integrate some of those measures. But I would say in general, our focus is going to be on sweat chemistry, I would say, in addition, in terms of what we'll be adding and what we're sensing. Primarily, we'll be focused on adding new biomarkers to our measurement panel.
Got it. Next question is, what is the price?
Yeah, so for industrial workers, we sell it on a subscription basis. The list price is $1,000 per worker per year, and that includes the whole solution. So it's the monitor, all the replacement patches, the integrated end-to-end software and platform, and so forth. So that's how we sell it. So it's available only on a subscription basis. You can't buy the patch separately from all of the services and software that surrounds it, that delivers the integrated solution. As we go into the clinical market, that model will likely change a little bit. But for industrial, it's a subscription, and the list price is $1,000 per worker per year.
Got it.
Or about $6 a day. A more better way to characterize it, perhaps.
Yep. All right. Next question: does ambient humidity impact the sweat sensor's accuracy?
Well, yes and no. We have to. Essentially not. It could, but what we've done through the way that the device is adhered to the skin is the way that we measure sweat rate is it's the evaporation of sweat off the surface of the skin, and we've sealed it onto the skin in such a way that we're confident that external humidity is not complicating that measurement or contaminating the results, if you will. So it's something we're very, we're keen to observe. One of our pilots is in Japan. We've seen some very interesting additional data points coming in based on the very high levels of humidity there. That are giving us good input in terms of product evolution. So I would say the product design is intended to avoid that, and as we deploy in these very high humidity environments, we're learning and fine tuning as we go.
Got it. Next question is, does your solution guarantee real-time communications in body signal tracking, or can you just see what already happened in the past?
Yeah, that's a great question. You can't, on the app, you can look at past. So we can display 24 hours of data on the mobile app. In addition, we do have some use cases where there's actually the device is put on, if we're doing a study, for example, a clinical study, or if people are interested in sort of measuring over a period of time their changes of physiology. The device can be, worn in a disconnected mode. You can collect the data. There's a micro USB port. So in some of our use cases, we actually, somebody will put the patch on, wear it for 24 hours, connect it into a micro USB, upload the data, and use it for study purposes or analysis, or look at, their change of condition over a 24-hour period, for example. So because we have storage on the device, we don't require connectivity. Of course, in our primary use case, we assume continuous, semi-continuous anyway, connectivity, and so that we can trigger real-time alerts. But it isn't required.
Okay. Next question is, can researchers get access to anonymized data?
That is our intent, and so the license gives us rights to the anonymized data for exactly that purpose. As yet, we have, we don't have sufficient numbers deployed that the data is would be meaningful yet from a research perspective. But absolutely, our intent is that we would provide the anonymized data for research purposes. One of the other applications, by the way, I should mention, is that we do foresee in the clinical space being a companion device for clinical trials, where you're looking for adverse effects, for example, from a particular drug that's in trial, and one of those might be, for example, changes to potassium levels, and so we could provide that in a fairly unique way. So we do see definitely a number of opportunities in sort of the research space, but anonymized data is something on our roadmap. Yeah.
Got it. And similar scenario, different use cases. Next question is, have you explored the health insurance policy companies like Aetna or firms like United Healthcare?
We've spoken to both workers' comp, life insurance, and health insurance companies, and we've gotten high interest really across all of them for looking at ways that this technology could be used for better risk management. As yet, we haven't sort of undertaken a co-development project or really looked at that. We can't lay out a use case in that space, but we certainly have had interest across all three insurance segments to look at ways the technology could be deployed to help them.
Got it. Next question, how often are patches changed or replaced?
Mm-hmm. The chemistry on the patch would last, we believe, probably 4 or 5 days before you begin to see erosion of the signal quality. Typically, it's daily. It's a shower-to-shower patch, so you would off and when you shower, because the device itself is water resistant but not waterproof. And so you would take it off, replace the disposable patch, and put it back on. So it's typically a daily replacement.
Okay. Yeah, and that's next question is similar. Is your device safe for 24/7 wearing?
It is. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And so far, this is the last. Oh, sorry. A couple more questions. I know you've got a hard stop at the top of the hour, so we'll certainly be respectful of your time. But a couple more questions here. How many external variables are being collected and analyzed for validation at this time, such as altitude, humidity, wind factors, barometric pressure, et cetera?
Yep. So right now for heat stress, we're looking only at one outside variable, and that is ambient air temperature. In Japan, actually, there's an index called, I'm pretty sure it's the heat bulb, and we get that out of on a given construction site. They collect that data already. There's devices deployed at the site that collect that data, and that's an input. The platform is built to consume external data through APIs, and so we're definitely cognizant of the fact that many of our models will assume other data sources. In mining, it might be gas readings and so forth, right? But for the moment, for our heat stress model, it's the ambient air temperature or a model like the heat bulb, which is a combination of, I think it's wind, heat, and humidity in Japan. So some form of sort of the environment.
Got it. Okay. And then last question so far, is the patch your only form factor?
It is today. I mean, we do look at taking, and we're working with a couple of companies around taking, for example, some of sweat sensing capability and deploying that in different form factors. So that could be, for example, in fabrics, in apparel. That we're talking about military and first responders. You might imagine, the ability to integrate some of this into a fabric, for example, where the sweat would be processed and read there. So we're exploring other form factors. Again, we view this as a platform that can be sort of adopted to multiple different use cases, but for the moment, what we have in the market is the patch, the Kenzen patch.
Got it. Okay. And now, of course, a couple of other questions have come in. This is always a good sign when you've got a lot of questions coming in. So next question is, security is very important here for both data inflow and data at rest. What are the measures? Sorry, let's try this again. Security is very important here for both data inflow and data at rest. What are the measures are taken in this solution? Any emphasis on edge hardware or security?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've implemented security at all levels. It's encrypted at rest. both on the device itself, on the if it's going to a mobile phone as well as the cloud, and it's transmitted in encrypted. In addition, we've been very focused on architecting the cloud backend to firewall off different elements of information. So I think I mentioned, for example, there's the safety supervisor can't go in and look at a worker's heart rate or other what would be deemed personal medical information. They can only look at the heat risk score for that individual. So we've sort of physically segmented off those data stores so that there's as little risk as possible of any intrusion and access, inappropriate access. In addition, we segment off physically the anonymized sensor data from personal identifying information, so that again, it's the risk of somebody coming in and actually being able to associate a device to an individual is as low as possible. So we're very alert to that. We certainly, as we're working through these pilots, we continue to surface additional things that companies are asking us to implement, but the underlying architecture is sort of incorporated into security, both at rest and at motion.
Got it. Okay. Next question: how do you mitigate the effects of clothing worn on top of the sensor?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, we've experienced some stuff as we deployed in Japan in very, very high humid environments, where we believe it may have held moisture in perhaps excessively beyond what we had originally anticipated. So we continue to work through the most effective ways of doing that. But essentially, if you look at the disposable patch, one of the characteristics is its wicking mechanism. So we evaporate the sweat out, and we've tested that in very, very high sweat environments. So we're certainly focused on how do you move the sweat continuously. But it's a good question. We're continuing to test that in terms of how clothing on top, may keep moisture in, and something that we need to be making sure we're designing to.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, next question. Looks like it's actually 3 questions in one, but let's go ahead and first question is, how are you getting a core body temperature measurement from a surface sensor? And then the follow-up questions are, how are you measuring hydration, and how does this measurement compare to a gold standard such as urine-specific gravity?
Great questions. I love it. So in terms of core body temperature, we have a proprietary model that is built around heat flux as a key input, but that's one of the areas that we've developed proprietary technology to support. And we benchmark, by the way, against ingestibles. So we've done hundreds and hundreds of comparative measures to ingestibles, and we're within, I think, less than 0.1 degrees Celsius. So it's a model based on heat flux. On hydration, it's a really, really great question. That's an area we've invested a lot in, very keenly interested in. One of the reasons we are interested in both bioimpedance as well as sweat rate is those are key elements of understanding hydration levels, as well as their near infrared optical sensor we have for interstitial fluid levels, where we can look at hydration levels immediately under the skin. So we have some existing models we built. We're still extensively testing those and not ready to release those in market. We're keenly interested in benchmarking it. One of the things we've talked to the Cleveland Clinic about is working with them on gold standard benchmarking. That there isn't a single gold standard for hydration measurement, and certainly as you look at the addition of electrolytes and ion imbalance and so forth, it becomes highly complicated. But the one that you mentioned is certainly one that we would expect to benchmark against. So we have all the inputs we think we need to do hydration. We built basic models. We're now working to identify clinical partners we can validate with. But it's a very complicated topic, I'll tell you.
Indeed. Yeah, and looks like we got the last question here, which is good timing because I know you got to go. You've already been very generous with your time, so very much appreciated. This last question I think you've already answered, but I'll ask it anyway. Is it an option to not to rent, but to buy a few units of the patch?
We do have a trial agreement where you can take a unit for some period of time. We don't want to. We're not in the business of. We're not a consumer company, so we sell strictly on a B2B basis, and so we deliver this as a solution. What we want to avoid is people are deploying this in a way that it doesn't achieve the outcome because we haven't sufficiently worked with them to kind of implement the design. So we do have a trial agreement that if people are interested, we can certainly talk to you about, where we can provide a patch, but you can't buy a patch. It's under one form of agreement or another, either a trial agreement or an enterprise agreement.
Got it. Okay. Very good. Well, I think I'm showing we are at the top of the hour, so I think that we'll wrap it up here. And Jim, I'll say thanks again for all your time and input here. This has been really valuable, I know, for everyone who's on now and everyone who will listen to the recording as well. So very much appreciated, and just want to say thanks to everyone who took time out of their busy schedules to join us here today. We hope you found it as valuable as I did, certainly. And it looks like we did have one other, not a question come in, but just someone saying thanks, Jim, for all the time and sharing what you did about what you guys are working on. Keep up the good work. So
thank you.
Thanks again, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We will go ahead and sign off, but look for the links to the recording for the webinar and also to the slides, and please share them with anyone else you think may be interested.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, everyone.